$2.7 billion in goods crosses the United States-Canada border every single day. That number alone should feel enormous, but it is not the most important part of this story. The deeper issue is what happens if the legal framework governing that trade suddenly stops applying. The rules that normally prevent trade wars between allies depend on institutions most people rarely think about. One clause buried inside global trade law can suspend those rules entirely under certain conditions. Very few people outside trade law circles ever pay attention to it. But once you understand how it works, the entire stability of North American trade starts to look more fragile. Picture a map of North America at night with highways glowing like veins of light. Every hour, trucks move auto parts from Ontario to Michigan and wheat from the Midwest into Canadian mills. Those shipments depend on rules created through the World Trade Organization and earlier agreements under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Those rules limit tariffs, discrimination, and sudden market bans between member countries. Businesses built entire supply chains assuming those protections would stay stable. If that assumption breaks, factories feel it first. After that, households begin noticing higher prices and unstable jobs. But buried inside those same agreements is a provision called the National Security Exception. The clause exists because governments insisted they must retain the right to protect national security. Under that exception, a country can take trade actions it considers necessary for security reasons. The legal language is intentionally broad and historically controversial. Economists warn that if countries abuse the clause, the global trade system weakens quickly. Governments defend it as a necessary safety valve. That tension between stability and sovereignty sits quietly inside the system until political conflict activates it. Historically, the clause appears in Article XXI of the GATT framework. It was written in 1947 when global trade institutions formed after World War II. The designers expected it to apply mostly during wars or severe geopolitical crises. For decades, governments avoided invoking it openly because doing so risked retaliation. That restraint helped the rules-based trading system survive political disagreements. Once one country uses a security exception aggressively, others feel pressure to follow. The stability of the entire framework begins depending on political trust instead of written rules. Read that again. The United States tested this boundary in 2018 using Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. The government argued those imports threaten national security by weakening domestic industrial capacity. The policy hit several allies, including Canada and the European Union. Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs targeting American exports like bourbon and motorcycles. The dispute escalated quickly despite deep economic integration between the two countries. Analysts watching the conflict warned it exposed a structural weakness in global trade law. If allies start framing economic disputes as security threats, the rules begin to unravel. That shift did not stay inside policy circles or legal debates. It reached factories, farmers, and consumers within months. American farmers suddenly faced tariffs on agricultural exports entering Canada and Europe. Canadian manufacturers worried about the cost of imported metal used in cars and machinery. Supply chains that depended on predictable pricing suddenly faced uncertainty. When companies cannot forecast costs, they delay investment and hiring decisions. That hesitation spreads quietly through regional economies long before headlines appear. And that is only the surface layer of the problem. The deeper issue is how the security exception operates legally. Unlike many trade disputes, national security claims are extremely difficult to challenge in international courts. Governments argue that security threats are inherently political judgments. Trade panels hesitate to override those decisions because doing so would infringe on sovereignty. The result is a gray zone where enforcement becomes uncertain. Businesses suddenly realize the legal protections they relied on might not hold during political conflict. There is a specific detail here that changes everything, and most coverage never leads with it. North American manufacturing depends on supply chains that cross the border multiple times before a product is finished. A car assembled in Ontario may contain engines from Michigan and electronics from Mexico. Tariffs applied at one stage ripple through every stage afterward. Even a small disruption multiplies costs along the chain. Those costs rarely stay inside corporations. They eventually appear in the prices households pay for vehicles and appliances. The next economic data release on manufacturing trade is approaching soon. Based on everything covered here, drop your prediction below. Do you think cross-border production is expanding or quietly slowing? Analysts have been watching freight volumes and customs data closely. Some signals suggest companies are already adjusting supply chains to reduce political risk. Others argue integration remains too deep to unwind quickly. Either outcome reveals something important about how resilient the system really is. But that question becomes far more serious once you examine how global institutions respond. The World Trade Organization was designed to settle disputes and prevent escalation. Yet national security claims limit how aggressively the organization can intervene. Panels reviewing past disputes acknowledge the clause exists, but struggled defining clear limits. In one widely discussed case involving Russia and Ukraine transit restrictions, the WTO cautiously evaluated whether security claims were applied in good faith. Even that limited review created controversy among governments. The moment legal uncertainty appears, political pressure quickly fills the gap. Picture this. It is late evening inside a trade ministry office during a sudden tariff dispute. Officials stare at spreadsheets showing billions in exports suddenly at risk. Advisors debate whether to retaliate, negotiate, or escalate through legal channels. Every option carries economic consequences for workers and industries at home. The clock keeps moving while shipments already sit at ports awaiting clearance. That pressure is the environment where security exceptions begin entering the conversation. And once that door opens, the trade system enters very uncertain territory. That uncertainty inside government offices did not stay theoretical for long. Within the first year of the steel and aluminum tariffs, retaliation from allies targeted more than $16 billion in American exports. Canadian countermeasures alone affected roughly $12.6 billion worth of U.S. goods, including steel, aluminum, and a carefully chosen list of consumer products. Those products were selected for political pressure because they came from key industrial states. Businesses that depended on those exports suddenly faced collapsing orders. Local workers rarely cared about the legal argument behind the tariffs. What they saw was demand disappearing in real time. The announcement of tariffs always arrives as a policy decision. The economic reaction arrives as numbers moving through supply chains weeks later. Truck shipments decline first, then factory orders begin shrinking, and eventually employment data reflects the slowdown. Economists often describe this as a lag effect that hides the damage early in a trade conflict. By the time the impact shows clearly in national statistics, the policy choices causing it may already be locked in. That delay is why trade disputes sometimes escalate further before leaders realize the scale of economic damage. The system is reacting faster than the political conversation. But that reaction also triggered something unexpected inside the global trading system. Countries began studying how the national security clause might protect their own industries if tensions intensified. Analysts at international policy institutes noticed a sharp increase in legal discussions about Article XXI after 2018. Governments that once avoided invoking the clause started treating it as a viable policy tool. That shift matters because the clause was originally designed as a last resort. Once multiple countries begin normalizing its use, the system changes character entirely. Trade rules stop acting like guardrails and start looking more like optional guidelines. Let that sit. While that legal shift unfolded, another pressure was building through the North American economy itself. The United States and Canada are each other's largest trading partners for many categories of goods. Energy flows from Canadian oil fields into American refineries every day. Agricultural products move both directions depending on the season and regional demand. When those flows remain stable, prices stay predictable for households buying fuel or food. When policy disrupts them, costs ripple through everyday life faster than most people realize. The price at a grocery store or gas station often reflects trade decisions made months earlier. The official narrative around tariffs often focuses on protecting domestic industries. Yet the underlying numbers frequently show a more complicated reality. Many industries depend on imported inputs even while exporting finished goods. Tariffs designed to shield one sector can raise costs for another sector down the supply chain. Manufacturers sometimes pay higher prices for materials they previously imported cheaply. Those higher costs eventually reach consumers through product pricing. The policy designed to defend domestic production can unintentionally make that production more expensive. But that contradiction was only the first layer analysts noticed. A deeper pattern appeared once economists compared trade data before and after the tariffs. Imports from targeted countries dropped initially, but imports from other countries increased. Companies simply shifted suppliers to avoid the new tariffs. That substitution meant domestic producers gained less advantage than expected. Meanwhile, the overall cost structure for businesses grew more complex. Supply chains were not collapsing, but they were reorganizing under political pressure. If you saw these signals building before the headlines intensified, how long ago did you start watching it develop? Let me know below. And that question matters because the next layer of this story sits inside the legal framework of the World Trade Organization itself. The WTO operates on principles designed to keep trade predictable and non-discriminatory. Countries normally must treat all trading partners equally and avoid sudden bans or extreme tariffs. Dispute panels exist to enforce those obligations when conflicts appear. But the National Security Clause sits slightly outside that enforcement system. Once a government claims security justification, the legal process becomes far less certain. For decades, most countries treated that uncertainty as a reason not to invoke the clause casually. The fear was simple. If one government stretched the definition of security too far, others might follow immediately. The result would be a cascade of retaliatory measures disguised as national security policy. Economists sometimes describe this as the security loophole risk inside global trade law. The loophole exists for emergencies, yet it can be politically tempting during economic disputes. Once opened, it becomes difficult to close again. That pattern already appeared during several recent global trade tensions. After the United States imposed security tariffs, other countries responded with their own national security arguments in different contexts. Russia invoked the clause regarding transit restrictions through its territory. Saudi Arabia referenced security concerns during a trade dispute with Qatar. Each case tested how far the exception could stretch before undermining the system. Trade scholars watched closely because every precedent slightly reshapes the boundaries of international law. The consequences of that legal evolution eventually reach ordinary households through prices and jobs. When supply chains shift suddenly, companies invest less in new factories and equipment. Slower investment leads to slower wage growth over time. Farmers and exporters face unpredictable access to foreign markets. Consumers experience higher costs when imported goods face new tariffs. The trade system may appear abstract, but its stability quietly shapes everyday economic life. When uncertainty enters the system, the first signals often appear in household budgets. But that is still not the deepest layer of this story. Because the most overlooked factor is how dependent modern economies have become on stable global trade roles. Roughly half of U.S. imports are intermediate goods used by American companies to produce something else. Those imports are not finished consumer products. They are components, materials, or technology embedded inside domestic production. If tariffs or restrictions disrupt those flows, domestic output can fall rather than rise. The policy meant to strengthen industrial capacity can sometimes weaken it instead. The irony becomes clearer once you zoom out to the scale of the North American market. The United States and Canada share one of the most integrated economic relationships on Earth. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement governs roughly $1.8 trillion in annual trade across the continent. Factories built under that framework assume open borders for parts and components. When governments introduce sudden barriers, companies face the expensive task of redesigning entire supply networks. That redesign can take years and billions of dollars. Picture this. You run a manufacturing plant dependent on parts arriving from two different countries. Your engineers built the production line around that specific flow of components. Overnight, a new tariff appears or a border delay disrupts shipments. Production slows immediately because the assembly line lacks one critical part. Workers stand idle while managers scramble to locate alternative suppliers. Every hour the line stops, the financial losses multiply. And that is where the next escalation begins. Production lines stopping for even a few hours rarely stay isolated inside one factory. Modern manufacturing works through synchronized logistics, where each supplier depends on another supplier upstream. A single delayed component can slow dozens of connected facilities across the continent. Economists call this a cascading supply disruption because the slowdown multiplies through the network. That multiplication explains why trade policy shocks often hit much harder than the initial tariff rate suggests. The policy might look narrow on paper, yet the economic impact spreads widely. Households eventually feel it through layoffs, delayed hiring, or rising prices. That cascading effect became visible during several recent supply chain shocks. During the pandemic, border slowdowns and shipping delays exposed how fragile just-in-time logistics had become. Factories that once kept only days of inventory suddenly faced months-long shortages. Automakers temporarily halted production across North America because microchips failed to arrive. Each shutdown cost companies millions of dollars and disrupted local labor markets. The lesson was unmistakable for executives watching closely. Stability in cross-border trade rules matters almost as much as the physical goods themselves. But that realization produced a strategic dilemma inside government policy circles. Leaders want the freedom to act quickly during genuine national security threats. At the same time, overusing that justification undermines confidence in the global trade system. Investors and manufacturers start assuming the rules may change unpredictably. Once companies believe that, they restructure supply chains defensively. Defensive supply chains cost more money and operate less efficiently. Those extra costs quietly appear in consumer prices months later. That number is not a typo. But the midpoint of this story reveals a deeper tension most viewers have not yet connected. For decades, economists believed the rules-based trading system would gradually reduce the risk of major trade conflicts. The logic was simple. Countries benefiting from stable trade would avoid policies that disrupt it. Yet the events since 2018 suggest political incentives can override that logic quickly. Governments facing domestic pressure sometimes prioritize short-term political gain over long-term economic stability. The system was designed assuming rational restraint. Recent history shows that restraint is not guaranteed. There is a specific detail mentioned earlier that now lands very differently. Remember the supply chains crossing the U.S. Canada border multiple times during production. That pattern was once celebrated as proof of economic integration. Today, some policymakers see it as a vulnerability if geopolitical tensions rise. Dependence on cross-border components can become a strategic concern during crises. Governments increasingly discuss economic security alongside national defense. Once economic policy enters the language of security, the legal door to exceptional trade measures opens wider. Read that again. That shift explains why analysts across Washington, Ottawa, and Brussels began studying how the National Security Clause might evolve. The clause was originally vague because its authors never expected frequent use. Today, governments are defining its boundaries through real disputes rather than theory. Every new case becomes a precedent other countries may reference later. The more often security language appears in trade conflicts, the more normalized it becomes. And normalization changes the incentives for future leaders facing political pressure. You are watching this calculation unfold in real time before most people have connected these dots. The policies discussed in technical legal language eventually shape the cost structure of everyday life. If supply chains reorganize for security rather than efficiency, products become more expensive. If trade disputes escalate into long-term retaliation, export markets shrink for farmers and manufacturers. Every adjustment filters through wages, investment, and household budgets. The consequences may appear slowly, but they accumulate relentlessly. Picture this. It is midnight inside a multinational company's risk analysis office. Analysts compare two scenarios on a glowing spreadsheet, one with stable trade rules and one with recurring security tariffs. In the second scenario, costs rise across logistics, materials, and compliance. Investors immediately notice which scenario delivers weaker profits. Capital begins moving toward regions considered politically stable. That shift can drain investment from communities dependent on export industries. If you drive, buy appliances, or work in manufacturing, this is not abstract policy. This is a household budget story unfolding inside global supply networks. Higher production costs eventually reach store shelves through price increases. Reduced exports affect employment in regions tied to international markets. These changes do not happen overnight, yet they build steadily beneath the surface. Economic systems rarely break dramatically. They drift gradually into new patterns. And that drift can last for years before people realize how far the system moved. But that still leaves one unresolved question about the legal structure behind it all. The National Security Clause was designed for rare emergencies, yet it now appears in economic policy debates regularly. Some trade lawyers argue the clause needs clearer limits to preserve the rules-based system. Others argue any limitation would weaken governments during real security threats. That debate remains unsettled across international institutions. And the longer it stays unresolved, the more uncertain the future of global trade becomes. Both positions cannot be fully correct at the same time. One view assumes trade stability must come first to protect economic growth. The other assumes governments must keep maximum flexibility to defend national interests. Both arguments appear reasonable depending on the circumstances. Yet the tension between them sits directly inside the legal architecture of global commerce. When political pressure rises, that tension surfaces quickly. Which version reflects the reality you see developing now and why? Because the next stage of this story does not unfold in legal textbooks. It unfolds in boardrooms, ministries, and shipping ports where decisions about supply chains happen daily. Companies are already evaluating whether to diversify suppliers away from politically sensitive routes. Governments are discussing friendshoring strategies that prioritize trade with trusted partners. Each adjustment slightly reshapes the global map of production. Over time, those adjustments could transform the structure of international trade itself. And that transformation would reach far beyond tariffs alone. The transformation becomes visible first in places most people never see. Shipping terminals quietly track where containers originate and where they are redirected. Freight analysts compare routing data and notice when supply chains begin shifting toward new partners. Governments often describe this shift using phrases like friendshoring or strategic resilience. The language sounds technical, but the meaning is simple. Companies start preferring politically reliable trade partners even if costs increase. That strategic shift changes how goods move across the global economy. That shift did not begin with one policy decision alone. It grew from years of disruptions that gradually weakened confidence in seamless global trade. The pandemic revealed how fragile supply networks could become during sudden crises. Energy shocks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine showed how geopolitics can disrupt entire commodity markets overnight. Governments around the world began discussing economic security with the same seriousness once reserved for military defense. Trade policy quietly moved into national security conversations in multiple capitals. Once that shift happens, the legal tools surrounding security exceptions suddenly gain far more attention. Let that sit. Because the numbers behind North American trade remain enormous even during political tension. Roughly $2.7 billion in goods still crosses the United States-Canada border every single day. Energy, machinery, vehicles, and agricultural products move constantly between both economies. Millions of jobs in both countries depend on that steady flow of commerce. If policy changes disrupt that rhythm, the consequences ripple through regional communities quickly. Workers in auto plants, farmers shipping grain, and drivers hauling freight all feel the impact. But the deeper structural vulnerability lies in how dependent modern economies have become on predictability. Supply chains today are optimized for efficiency rather than redundancy. Companies minimize inventory and rely on precise delivery schedules. That efficiency keeps consumer prices lower during stable periods. Yet it also leaves little margin when political shocks interrupt trade routes. Even minor disruptions can multiply across the system faster than policymakers expect. Picture this. A logistics manager watches a digital map showing trucks approaching the border overnight. Every vehicle carries components needed for morning production runs. Suddenly, new inspections or tariffs slow those trucks by several hours. Assembly lines scheduled for dawn now lack the parts they require. Workers arrive, machines sit idle, and managers calculate the cost of every lost hour. That single delay can echo across dozens of companies before the day ends. And the data showing those disruptions rarely appears immediately in official statistics. Trade volumes, employment figures, and price indices all publish with delays. By the time the numbers confirm a slowdown, the policy choices causing it may already be entrenched. Economists call this the visibility lag in economic systems. Political narratives often move faster than measurable evidence. That gap makes trade conflicts particularly difficult to resolve once they escalate. That is where the earlier detail about cross-border supply chains suddenly carries much greater weight. The same integration once praised as an economic success also means disruption spreads rapidly. Every factory relying on imported parts becomes sensitive to geopolitical shifts. Every exporter relying on foreign markets becomes exposed to retaliation. Integration delivers enormous efficiency during stability. During tension, it becomes a transmission channel for economic shock. But that reality also explains why many governments now pursue diversification strategies. Instead of relying on one dominant trade partner, companies explore alternative suppliers across several countries. Governments encourage domestic production for certain strategic industries. Energy infrastructure is redesigned to reduce dependence on a single region. None of these changes happen overnight. Yet, taken together, they slowly reshape the structure of global trade networks. That restructuring may sound distant from everyday life, yet its consequences land directly in household budgets. Diversified supply chains often cost more to maintain. Domestic production of strategic goods usually requires subsidies or higher prices. Businesses pass those costs forward through the goods consumers by each week. The global system that once prioritized lowest possible price gradually shifts toward resilience. Resilience has value, but it rarely comes free. And that brings the story back to the number that opened everything. $2.7 billion moving across one border every day represents a level of economic interdependence few regions share. The deeper vulnerability is not simply tariffs or political rhetoric. The vulnerability is how much modern prosperity depends on trade rules remaining predictable. Once countries begin stretching security exceptions to resolve economic disputes, that predictability weakens. And once predictability weakens, every participant in the system starts hedging against future shocks. The next economic data releases will begin reflecting decisions already happening quietly inside corporations and ministries. Some indicators may show supply chains stabilizing again. Others may reveal companies diversifying away from old patterns. Analysts will debate whether the changes are temporary or structural. Yet one reality remains clear. The rules that governed global trade for decades are facing new pressure. And pressure inside legal frameworks rarely stays contained forever. The next 30 days may reveal whether current tensions settle into negotiation or drift into longer-term restructuring. Businesses are watching customs data, freight traffic, and investment flows for early signals. Governments are watching the same indicators while calculating their next policy steps. Both sides know the economic stakes stretch far beyond a single tariff dispute. The architecture of global trade depends on trust that the rules will hold. But if that trust erodes further, how many countries will test the same security loophole next?